In the depths of hell, in the darkest corner of reality, lurks an evil so deadly, the home and breeding ground for the nightmare child. Prepare to be disturbed. Kiss, Psycho, Circus, the Nightmare Child.
Kiss is a band that has built an empire, not just on music, but on branding. If there is a product that can bear the Kiss logo, Gene Simmons has probably tried to slap it on there. From action figures to pinball machines, condoms to coffins, Kiss's merchandising knows no shame. And in the year 2000, at the tail end of the 90s first-person shooter boom, the world was graced with Kiss, Psycho Circus, the Nightmare Child, a game that barely featured the band and made absolutely no sense. Marketed as a rock and roll fueled horror shooter, the game instead dropped players into a surreal nightmare inspired by Todd McFarlane's Psycho Circus comic book series. Instead of controlling Kiss, players assume the roles of 4 musicians who transform into Kiss-like warriors to battle grotesque monsters and prevent the birth of an apocalyptic entity called the Nightmare Child. Despite its over-the-top premise and surreal aesthetic, the game was a critical and commercial afterthought, falling into the depths of gaming obscurity as one of the strangest brand tie-ins ever attempted. So how did we get here? How did Kiss go from face-painted rock gods to barely present protagonists in a shooting game about demonic fetuses? And more importantly, was the game any good? This is the story of Kiss, Psycho Circus: The Nightmare Child, a video game that proves Kiss will put their name on absolutely anything. Before we dive into the game itself, let's acknowledge the history that led to Psycho Circus. Kiss has always had a flair for the ridiculous when it comes to licensing. The band's 1978 made-for-TV movie, Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, is a perfect example of their commitment to throwing their brand at anything with a pulse. That film saw the band fighting evil animatronics in an amusement park while spouting lines like, "We don't work with a net, we don't rehearse, and we don't kiss on the first date." The movie was so disastrous that even the band members disowned it, yet it remains a cult classic today. From there, Kiss moved on to action figures, pinball machines, a Marvel comic printed with real Kiss blood, seriously, and even the infamous Kiss casket, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. A coffin with Kiss branding for the die-hard fan who wants to rock and roll all night and party every day into the afterlife. So, when someone suggested putting Kiss into a first-person shooter based on their comic book Kiss Psycho Circus, of course they said yes, but did anyone stop to ask, should they? If Kiss was going to get involved with a comic book adaptation, you might assume it would be something larger than life, full of explosions and over-the-top rock and roll spectacle. Instead, they got Todd McFarlane's Psycho Circus, a dark, surreal horror comic series that has nothing to do with music and everything to do with grotesque creatures and nightmare-fueled imagery. McFarlane, best known as the creator of Spawn, was at the height of his influence in the late 90s. His signature gothic aesthetic, filled with intricate monster designs and dark fantasy worlds, made him one of the biggest names in comics. But why Kiss? Well, Kiss had already worked with McFarlane to produce a line of action figures, so a collaboration on a video game tied to his Psycho Circus comic must have seemed like an easy sell. The result was a game that looked visually unique, but felt thematically disconnected from the band. While the game's monsters and environments reflected McFarlane's signature nightmarish style, the gameplay itself lacked the intensity or personality you might expect from a game with the Kiss name attached to it. Instead of embracing the over-the-top theatrics of Kiss, the game leaned more into McFarlane's horror aesthetic, making it feel more like a Spawn spin-off than anything truly connected to rock and roll. Released in 2000 for PC, Kiss Psycho Circus the Nightmare Child was a first-person shooter that had all the trademarks of a late 90s, early 2000s shooter. It was heavily inspired by Quake and Unreal, featuring large gothic environments, grotesque monsters, and fast-paced gunplay. But the question remained, where exactly was Kiss in all of this? The game's story had nothing to do with the actual band members. Instead, players controlled the Elder, 4 musicians who transform into Kiss-inspired warriors based on the Demon, Gene Simmons, the Star Child, Paul Stanley, the Space Ace, Ace Frehley, and the Catman, Peter Criss. Their mission? To stop the Nightmare Child, a demonic entity attempting to be born into existence. While the visuals were surreal and twisted in a way that mirrored McFarlane's comic book aesthetic, the game itself was a pretty by-the-numbers shooter. It lacked the polish of its contemporaries like Quake and Unreal Tournament, suffering from stiff controls, repetitive level design, and some truly questionable voice acting. The soundtrack? Surprisingly, it wasn't even packed with Kiss hits. Instead, the music was a mix of atmospheric tracks that barely reminded you that this was a Kiss game at all. Behind the scenes, Psycho Circus was developed by Third Law Interactive. Unfortunately, Psycho Circus would be one of Third Law's only major releases before the studio quietly faded into obscurity. So, who was this game actually for? Video game fans had better options, and Kiss fans were probably too busy buying collectible action figures to notice it even existed. At the end of the day, Kiss Psycho Circus, The Nightmare Child, is less a great game and more a bizarre artifact of an era when Kiss would put their name on anything. It's a perfect example of the band's relentless dedication to branding, whether it makes sense or not. While it may not be remembered as a classic shooter, it deserves a place in the Hall of Fame for ridiculous video game tie-ins. Would Gene Simmons endorse a Kiss-branded breakfast cereal if given the chance? Probably. Would Paul Stanley agree to a Kiss line of scented candles? Absolutely. And would they approve another Kiss video game if someone pitched it to them today? You can bet your platform boots on it. Until that inevitable day, Kiss Psycho Circus the Nightmare Child remains the ultimate example of rock and roll branding gone off the rails. Psycho Circus may not have set the gaming world on fire, but one thing is certain. No matter how bizarre, confusing, or unnecessary the product, Kiss will always find a way to sell it.